Next up, I'm going to invite the fabulous Peter Vanderwal to the stage. Peter is from an organisation called Stratigos, is that right? Stratigos, there we go. Thank you, Pete. And Pete is going to be talking about blockchain technology in social and blended finance. So welcome to the stage, Pete.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks very much. So we had one of the speakers had to leave shortly, so we've had something of a reorganisation of the agenda. So I'm going to ask everyone to leave their virtual meeting space and get into a virtual time-travelling machine, just briefly, as we go to setting the scene a little around the language and the culture and the enabling environments which are a necessary part of what we're trying to unlock here, which is, of course, new capital. So, of course, why do we need new capital? I'm going to rush through this. We all know that funding sources are reducing. We know that there's somewhere between a 2.5 and a 4 trillion per annum funding gap between now and 2030. We know that the public purse is not going to cut it, and so there's this general sense that making more efficient use of the money and making more of a capitalistic, more of an efficiency dividend approach to funds is going to get us over this funding gap. So this is all, sorry, I think my marker right is indeed good to go again. So what we have in terms of the positive elements fueling this, we have, of course, the millennial inheritance coming in over the next 15 years, which is going to be the largest transfer of cash the world has ever seen, a very different mentality around how these funds are used. We have a greater sense of the import of working with both innovative financing solutions and innovative technology solutions. And there's a real impetus, not just amongst community groups and millennials, but everyone involved in whether it's business or commerce or governance, politics. There's a sense that we have to do better when it comes to working with all members of communities in all countries across the planet. We certainly know that the COVID restrictions and the impositions placed upon communities in terms of economic growth and innovation opportunities are going to be felt long into the future. We know that the funding gap is not being closed. The UN General Assembly last year made a strong point of saying that, you know, in terms of our financing commitments, the surge that we'd hoped to see through the private sector is just not coming. And so, as I say, we've got a financing gap of not just 2.5 trillion per year to hit the 2030 goals, but in fact maybe as high as $4 trillion. When we think about, you know, the trickle-down effect, even if we do get private capital involved, and we think about, well, the point of private capital is to make more private capital for itself, let's say that 1% of it gets put aside to specific targets related to the SDGs, we're then talking about having to mobilise something like 400 trillion per annum additional. So this is, of course, a massive challenge, and one I've got to get a bit of a reality check in here, we're just not close to. That being said, there's a lot of very smart people, very committed people doing a lot of really interesting things in this space. And just behind me on the screen, we see a number of different types of new mechanisms coming to the fore. So green bonds, which are already discussed today, impact bonds, social yield notes, blended finance, all of these different opportunities which essentially are trying to do one thing and really one thing only, help us get towards the SDGs. So, of course, they have to do more with the money, they have to be more effective, they have to actually be able to use a little bit of leverage to scale up to quite substantial terms, and really, really critically, they need to be sustainable. And this is one of the elements that we were just talking about in the break in terms of, you know, wonderful that there are these brilliant ideas up here, but unless these innovations are also set for scalability and sustainability, it's all going to they'll be as strong as the weakest link in the chain. Quickly go through the types of finance. Blended finance we're talking about here. What we want to do is get public funds and unlock private funds. That's the deal. We're just seeing whether we can de-risk, we can make it less scary for private capital to go into things which are going to have an impact on the SDGs. What we're seeing is a lot of guarantees. Yay, that's okay, that's great. But what we're really not seeing is, I'm not even sure whether I can do this on this screen, direct investment in opportunities is tiny. It's that tiny little bar right at the top there. What's also germane to this particular discussion is where, in terms of the SDGs, the 17 goals, where the funding is going. And this graph here, it's 2 years old from an OECD meeting in Paris in 2018. What this shows is two major types of support: facilities on the one hand, funds on the other hand. Facilities, much more technical assistance, much more working with entities to build up the capacity of smaller organisations to be investor ready, whereas the funds are actually taking money and investing it. We look at where the primary areas are for this. One area which might surprise is perhaps SDG 5, gender equality, but there's a lot, particularly microfinance initiatives, which go in there directed at women community members, and so that's really high in terms of the facility space. Then you've got SDG 13, climate change, which is obviously a big one, economic growth and development, are the other obvious ones. Infrastructure, nice and easy, everyone loves infrastructure, which is good for what we're talking about here. We have seen a lot of very disparate ideas, a lot of different measurement systems, so this is what we call blended finance 1.0, and what we need to do is get to a greater sense of structure and measurability and a common lexicon. We already talked about this idea of a common lexicon just before. I wrote up something called the ABCs of Innovative Finance. That's one of the resources which I'm sure will be shared with the team. But immediate thought, listening to everyone's pitch here, was this is not talking the language of investors. This is talking the language of grants, of research, of not-for-profits. And if we're really talking about mobilising private capital, we need to mobilise our own linguistic capacities and start speaking the right language, so that when we say equity, we're meaning what our financiers mean when they say equity. When we say development or impact, we're actually talking on a common platform. We don't have that at the moment, and it's one of the things which I think is really creating this differentiation between investable opportunities and ideas. Ideas are wonderful and they can be world-changing unless you can quantify this nasty little thing called risk. And as development professionals, we have a very different idea of risk to financiers. Unless we can quantify that down to sort of a third decimal point, our wonderful innovative ideas are not going to get what we want, which is impact investments. Those double-sided investments which have both the impact return and the social return. It's a spectrum, so you've got everything from your grants down at this side, so that's just donated capital, all the way up to your very strong return-oriented investments up here, and anywhere in between. You always see this sort of spectrum in any conversation around innovative finance. Really where we want to head is sort of in this area here. So very much around measured, intentional investments which have at least a double bottom line. Quickly go through this. Paying for results and impact bonds are two really highly visible types of initiatives. Pay for results has a history of 10, 15 years as donors moved from paying and praying to really, okay, we're not going to pay you unless you do what you said. And then that turned into impact bonds, which are very, very high profile and have gotten way too much oxygen for what they are. Given that, in fact, really what we're seeing now is less than $1 billion of investment in impact bonds worldwide. What, though, we're going to have to do in order to grab and leverage these opportunities, these innovative financing mechanisms, is harnessing innovative methodologies, approaches and tools in terms of the technologies which are coming out as well. So the blockchain or distributed ledger technology offers wonderful amounts of verification, of inbuilt trust or distrust, depending on how you look at it, on scalability and endurability. And despite the bad name and crypto and all the rest of that, I mean, talk about distributed ledger technology, not about crypto, not about a blockchain or the blockchain. DLT, and you sort of avoid the terrible emotional responses that often you find with blockchain conversations. AI, scary, yes, but a way of the future, even for small things, just making your everyday processes easier has massive potential to streamline. And what we're trying to do, really, is make measurement and flow of capital much easier and more transparent. So whether we have also remote sensing, satellites, drones, etc., being able to measure impact, environmental impact in a much more cost-efficient and scalable manner. The Internet of Things, of course, is all part and parcel of this pantheon of new technologies that we have to be really down with. So if we're talking about being able to assess whether the erosion around a particular coastal area has reduced over a certain period of time, we can monetize and put a cost on that and connect the investment of the initiatives which worked towards that conservation effort being directly then tied to payments by results. It makes a very attractive proposition, and how we all make all of those sort of different technologies, and the ones which are still to come, 5G obviously big in the news at the moment, and meld those into practical, transparent, investable opportunities. That's the nut to crack. There's a book that I put together for DFID last year around connecting finance to results, goes into a lot of detail. I'm sure that'll be available as well. This is sort of the critical slide, and I'm sorry I got to it when I'm already 5 minutes overdue, but really this is about where emerging technologies can make a huge difference in terms of what we're trying to do. So it is crowding in funding, it's achieving scale, it's about enabling innovation, giving people the space and the sandboxes, if you like, to be able to play around and see what works in a not real world, not scary environment, and looking into the future, seeing that what we do now, the lessons of now, aren't forgotten so shortly forward into the future, so that we have this immutable record of what works and what doesn't. We can quantify, we can put numbers and values around these positive impacts. We can tie them all in to the SDGs. This is what we're aiming for. This is obviously not a pitch for funding for this particular initiative, but this is an area that we work in, we feel very strongly about. And we're translators. We bridge that gap between the private sector and the impact sector to build platforms that we can all work together in a sort of trustworthy, confidence-imbued manner. So I'm sorry that I went so far over. I'm too passionate, I'm sure.
There's nothing wrong with passion, Peter. So I could say we're all actually invested in that topic.